Hey everyone, it's Gabby
and Danny
and Manny,
and you're listening to Oye, Let's Talk.
A disclaimer from Oye, Let's Talk podcast hosts. We are aware this is a controversial topic and understand all sides of the topic, which is why we are exploring different perspectives on this episode.
Hey everyone, if you heard my girl Danny, my co-host, then you probably realize that we're talking about people of color. It can be a little bit of a tough, heavy topic, but I just want to emphasize we're not talking about people specifically, but rather the term. So we're approaching this and we're going to outline it all for you in twofold, starting with the definition, which also has two different ones according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary. So Webster's first definition is, in terms of people of color, it means it's a person whose skin pigmentation is other than, and especially darker than, what is considered a characteristic of people typically defined as white. So basically, the first definition is melanin based. Quite literally, how white are you, or are you of any color whatsoever? The second definition is a person who is of a race other than white, or who is of mixed race. So that has a little more cultural significance and undertones. That's where I think things can get a little hazy, but we're going to explore all of that in a moment. I do completely want to acknowledge the new term that has taken, I would say, society at the helm, and not everyone is as familiar with BIPOC. That's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. This is, again, a definition. It is pronounced BIPOC, and it's a term really specific to the United States, so you can't just go anywhere with it. It's intended to center the experiences of Black and Indigenous groups, which is what B and I stand for, and demonstrate solidarity between communities of color. So BIPOC, people of color, is POC, and then Black and Indigenous is at the front. So there's no confusion about two groups who have been historically marginalized in comparison to other people who may have been or who may identify with the term people of color. Whew, that was a lot. I know. If you need to re-listen to those definitions, that's perfectly okay. But today we're going to all talk about it, since all of us here at Oye Let's Talk identify as Latinx or Latino, where Latinos fit in the confusion of what's race, ethnicity, culture, people of color, and all that fun stuff. According to NPR, which I totally rely on a lot of the cases, Code Switch is a great podcast. If you listen to Oye Let's Talk, you'd probably be a fan. But in one of their episodes, they totally dissect what people of color kind of means. And just to quote a few things, like the OG POCs are Black people, Native Americans, and darker skinned Latinos, particularly those of Mexican origin. Because no one could really argue that those groups of people had history of being racialized in the United States. And when we say racialized, it's basically being put as other. Now, would you all agree those are probably the three groups, or do you feel like it's a little more mixed?
I think for the most part, yes. I think that those are the main minorities that have been targeted, and why it makes total sense why they would be considered a person of color. And I struggle with the definition of it, because in terms of it being politically correct, for example, and I'm going to quote an NPR article who took quotes from listeners on this very same topic to gauge how people felt about it. And I'm going to quote Caleb Smith, a 40-year-old. He says, "The term people of color is something I do not feel comfortable using because it sounds a lot like the term colored, which was a term used in the Jim Crow era here in Mississippi and was used on water fountains in swimming pools and schools. And it just kind of serves as a reminder to me of what we had and how bad Jim Crow segregation was." I feel similarly toward this, if we're going to get a little personal about the topic. When I think of the term people of color, I think back to that segregated era where whites were, people who were considered of a white race went to different schools, had different bathrooms, and African Americans who are considered Black were quote unquote people of color. So to me, in terms of politically correctness, I don't ever really use the word people of color because I don't know where it fits, if that makes sense. I would never want to be insensitive or have it be taken the wrong way, because at the end of the day, it is a label. And I think it's very personal. So I think if you consider yourself a person of color, that's entirely up to you. But I do think that if we as a society make these labels for other people, which is what these definitions make it sound like, I'm not comfortable with that, if that makes sense.
No, I totally think that's fair. And kind of going back to like melanin versus like whatever the other term you want to, or the other definition you want to use. I do feel like people of color, like, it's kind of an all-encompassing way to refer to anyone who's not white.
Right.
And
Which is what even is that? Is that like people from Europe, from the Middle East, from like just you being white passing, like you're considered white? You know what I mean? Like it's so.
And
I
that's the
hate labels.
difficult, I think that's the difficulty in all of it, where it's like, where are the lines? And even at Gabby asked at the top of the episode, where do Latinos fit in that? I think we have so many skin colors and we range from so many different origins that it's hard. I think we always go back to trying to put ourselves into boxes.
Mhm.
And it's difficult. It's so difficult because not a box applies to everybody.
that's what I kind of want to talk about in the term of people of color. So, like, kind of going back, I'm referencing the NPR Code Switch episode again. Like, POC now includes Asians of all backgrounds, like, no matter your skin tone, right? So, Pacific
Mhm.
Islanders, Arab, Middle Eastern, North African people, especially those who are Muslim. So, like, the religious identification can, like, apply as there too. And it's basically any minority group that's been denied to this quote unquote whites only club, right? So, like, in social circles or businesses where the whiter you were, the more accepted you are. So, anyone who's been othered or is made to feel foreign, or just like off the bat recognized as perhaps not the most American because, at the end of the day, they don't look what you expect them to look like, or their skin tone is different in a way that may not mesh with where you're at. And I think if people of color is meant to be all encompassing, like, at this point, maybe we should just be better about like recognizing people for who they are. So if they identify as Arab, like, refer to them as Arab as opposed to, oh, aren't you a person of color? Or I'm a person of
Yeah, I
color.
just feel like for me this is so old school. You know what I mean? Like it sounds like such a harsh label. It seems like we're even othering them on another layer, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I don't understand why this is even in our vocabulary.
I honestly didn't even think about it until you mentioned that quote, Danny, where saying the word colored almost gives you like flashbacks to seeing, hey,
Yeah.
colored people only. I didn't even
And
think
I'm
about
sure a
that.
lot of people feel that way. And actually, fun fact, I'm not gonna name the company where this happened at, but I know a reporter who, when the Black Lives Matter movement was a big deal during the pandemic, she went live and she's white, white passing, white American. I don't know if she's European at all, but she's blonde. Not that it has anything to do with it, but I can see how people can take this, like, oh, this is coming from like a white blonde girl kind of thing. She said, I'm standing here, something along the lines of, hi, we're here live where the Black Lives Matter protest just started. As you can see, there's a lot of people of color. And oh my gosh, once the newscast ended, she got so much comments from viewers saying, how could she say that? How could she label them that way? She had, this big talk with management. Management didn't know how to respond to this. And so I do think that, like, people are not, it's not that people are sensitive, it's just that I can see how this could be insulting because, again, you're othering them even more, you're categorizing them, and like Manny said, you're putting them into this box of, yeah, they're not white, Caucasian, blonde, blue eyes, the way we used to idealize like the European white standard. I'd like to think that we've moved past that, right? Like, we've seen so much diversity here in the United States that, to me, this term has just, I don't know why it's been a hot topic of discussion recently, especially among Hispanics.
So, go on, Manny, go ahead.
No, I want to go back, circle back to what you were saying, Gabby, about now this word, because Danny is saying, it kind of gives us flashbacks to the past of how this word was used. But now this title, person of color, is being more inclusive of, I guess, what we once called minorities. It's now all encompassing, a bigger umbrella for, I guess, marginalized groups, or however you want to call it. It's just another term now. But I don't know. I
Is
think
it really?
no. Including white Asian Americans, or even white Latin Americans, even white Caribbeans. I mean, sometimes you're a person of color, and then sometimes you're not. So then is the confusion of
When
this
you say when
definition.
you say not, you're talking about the skin tone, correct? Just to clarify
Right.
that.
No,
Right.
because if this this, it has two definitions.
Right.
A
That's
la-
the confusing part.
Right. I feel like we're all white passing. We are all Hispanic, Latin American, Caribbean. Would you call yourself a person of color? And one definition, you are other than white. None of us identify as white in America within the
Technically.
category. But at the same time, we're not melanated enough to be like, hey, I'm a person of color.
That's why I think it's such a personal thing. Like I recall hearing like multiple friends of mine from like different places like Colombia, Peru, even Venezuela, I think, and I was like taken aback because to me they're all white looking and they're like, "Yeah, because people of color like me." And I was just like, "What?" And that again, it's such a personal thing. I feel like I am no one to be like, no, you're not, because if they identify that way, yeah, they do.
Yeah, but okay, so here's where I get tripped up, right? And I've
Mm-hmm.
asked a bunch of people this. I almost posted it on my Instagram, but I didn't want to open myself up to that much hate. But so I know, like, I don't really love the term white passing, because I feel like I'm white. Like, in all intents of the word, like, I am white. I'm not as white as some of my other colleagues or friends, but I'm definitely not as brown as some of my other friends, and I'm hardly brown, to be honest. But when I ask a group of white people, or white people have assumed that I am a person of color, like off the bat. Like before I
Interesting.
speak or I walk up to them, because my features are slightly different or I have dark features. So that's where I get tripped up, that the assumption, yeah, it's personal. Like maybe I personally don't know if I consider myself a woman. I consider myself maybe a woman of color. I don't think I open myself up to like say person of color all the time.
What's the difference?
So I feel like as a woman, as women we're marginalized more as well. So I do identify with the struggle of being a female Latina in
But why can't
spaces
you
where
just say that
I'm
if
not
you
white enough. But I don't feel like I feel like I definitely am more privileged than a black man.
what about a black woman?
Yeah, I'm privileged there too, but I feel like I would have similar experiences when it
So
comes
okay, so
to
that's where my confusion and my reaction of me taking a
questioning
step
it.
back, yeah, comes into play is you are a Latina woman, correct? That's the way you identify yourself.
Yes.
And say your best friend is a black woman as well. She identifies as a person of color or a woman of color, and so do you. However, your skin tone is not remotely as dark, or you yourself say like you are white passing or more geared toward the white
That
race.
I'm white. Yes, I
Right,
look white.
yeah.
Not white race, but I'm white in color.
Would you still tell that woman, hey, I'm also a person of color? Or would you
Yes.
feel some type of way? Yes.
No, I
No
would say I
hesitation.
consider myself a woman of color, and I will say that next to a black woman or next to a brown woman, because to me, I'm there, like I can support them. I'll have that sense of camaraderie. I feel like we have similar upbringing, like we have stuff to be discussed. Like we have a sense of foundation that would be similar, because we also have that gendered aspect to it. I
Okay.
feel more in touch to that. Now, like even between Manny and I, like let's say if Manny was a white man or Manny was a black guy or something, I feel like when it comes to like male dominance, like I have been inferior in a lot of situations when you add the gender aspects to it.
Well,
And
right.
sometimes I feel inferior because I am not considered a white woman. It's because I am a Latina. So it's
Oh,
like
interesting. Okay.
I've been, oh, you're feisty, or can you speak English, or etc. Or oh, Latino women clean a lot, etc. So there's different nuances to my gender
So I
and my
guess
ethnicity.
my question is, what is the difference between considering yourself a person of color when you're speaking of not your skin tone, but the otherness versus a minority? Because at the end of the day, what I'm hearing is you feel othered / you're a minority, right? So,
So like that depends too can how you use the term minority, because not too far back, like you know how they say like females are the minority,
mhm,
because women used to not be in the workplace as much. Women were considered quote unquote a minority, and then they
right.
changed it to be an ethnic definition. And that's like my issue with the term minority overall. That's my
Mhm.
discussion to it. Now when there's 7 billion people in the world, and I don't know, I think it's like what, uh 2 billion in the United States, something like that. Now, if I'm going to call myself a person of color among every single person, like I don't feel like I scaled up in that aspect. Like I feel like there's way too many nuances, there's way too many options or like comparisons to be made in that aspect that I don't feel comfortable taking up that kind of space. Me personally, because I feel like I am more privileged than other people, like the generic population. I've been more privileged um than certain men who are of color, so define you, or men who have more melanin, because I pass off more as a white woman. Now, going back to my main point is this whole time, this is what I have self reflected on, but it's understanding that even though I may consider myself white in terms of skin tone, not as race, right
Mhm.
off the bat, the white race, I have asked, I've lived in Missouri, I've been in Indiana, I now live in Georgia, and the conversation comes up among those that I'm close to, and very few, actually never, no one has ever said, "Yeah, you've passed off as white to me."
Interesting.
Right.
And
So you, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go finish.
so, like, white friends that I'm like, "Oh, did you feel comfortable approaching me, or like you didn't hear me speak because maybe it was my accent?" And people have always pointed like, "No, I knew you weren't white because you have these dark features, or the way you walk, or what you dress."
The way
Like,
you walk.
yeah, people have told me like, oh, the way you carry yourself, like
Interesting.
nonverbal, just purely
That's so
assumptuous, like
strange.
first
Also, I would
impression.
never ask somebody, "Hey, do you feel comfortable enough speaking to me?" Like, I don't
Well,
know,
no,
like,
I say
how the
like, oh,
conversations come about.
do you find me approachable? Like as a joke, like I'll
Oh,
talk to
okay, yeah,
people,
you
and
would do
then it's
that.
like, yeah, I'm like, oh, well, could you tell that I was white, or could you tell like I was Hispanic before my accent? Like I'll have those open conversations with people,
Right.
and then that's where my again now I'm stuck between the two definitions, because it's all right.
Which
Well,
also your name gives it away too, like, even without seeing a
yeah,
photo of you or anything, you know?
yeah,
Gabby Anonymous.
if you just hear me like, "Hey everyone, this is Gabby," I feel like that's also passing.
Right, right.
Right. So Gabby, it's in certain moments, you are not white because of your features, but also you are white because your skin pigmentation is not that dark. And I feel like, right? Am I concluding that right?
Yes, absolutely. But I will compare that in Missouri, you don't know how many times like my colleagues would like put their arm against mine and they're like, "Yeah, you're darker, can't you tell?" And it was
Oh my
stuff like
god.
that, like
What?
that. Like if we were out in the sun and I tanned, like they're like, "Oh, if you don't turn red, are you white?" So I thought that was funny that that was their measurement.
Oh my god. Well, okay. I think listen, I think this word, the article that I read off NPR, it's an old article actually. It's from 2014, which is actually more recent than the one that you're referencing, Gabby. Just so you know, it's also off the Code Switch podcast. And this article details how we've, as a society, moved from colored to minorities to
Right.
now people of color. So in essence, it has been a way, and he references it in the article where it's now more inclusive. But at the same time, we live now in an era, and Danny just referenced this was written back in 2014. I feel like now we've come back around where it's like, is this the best way to describe all of us? And I don't know, it's too dicey. It's too dicey because lines are too blurred. You can be a person of color in this instant but not this instant. Or
Mhm.
even when that reporter said people of color, she wasn't incorrect. She was using the definition of, an editor saw that and she said person of color. Hey, she's
It's
correctly
not
using this
politically correct.
Right. So
Right.
I think just using the word person of color almost seems troubling to me. Honestly, I think Gabby said it best. Hey, let's just refer to people what they are instead of making this one super long, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious,
Right.
terminology, Black, Indigenous, people of color. Now, 3 years from now, they're going to add four
BIPOC.
more
Like
letters.
what?
Yeah. So, let's stop, as we've constantly said on this podcast. We've dissected the US Census and how we only have certain boxes to pick from. And now, we talked about different intersectionalities where at the end of the day, these terms are made to describe a group of people. Those terms change, and sometimes we can reflect on it and be like, this is maybe not even the best term to use or build off of. And honestly, I think I'm gonna stay away from this word because I
Yeah,
think it gets dicey. It
it
gets
does.
dicey. It
And
really.
then I feel like it opens doors for needing to explain yourself in every instance
Mm-hmm.
that you're in, like what Gabby was saying, like, oh, I think I would in this scenario but not necessarily in this scenario. It's
Right.
like, oh my gosh. I just wanted to briefly talk about this blog post that I saw in my research on this particular term, and it's by a Desi guy. For those of you who don't know what Desi is, it's a person that's usually from India or Pakistan. And the article is called "What's Wrong with the Term Person of Color." I'm just gonna read a little snippet of it because it's really long. But basically, he compares, like he says, being a Desi kid in St. Louis is not like being a Black kid in St. Louis or anywhere else. Even if we live in the same neighborhoods, Black people in the U.S. largely have their ancestry in formerly enslaved peoples, and most South Asian folks are immigrants or immigrants' children. So essentially, he's talking about having that racialized experience, how that could be like a common theme, but you can't ever compare both, because, or either I should say, because one is associated with like violence and literally the color of your skin, and the other one is colonization in South Asia, for example. So that's where I sort of fall into this term, and why I was again taken aback by my friends who consider themselves people of color, because I feel like you can't ever compare, like no two struggles are the same, if that matters. And it's not that one is above the other one, or one, to discredit what a minority went through in comparison to the other. But I just feel like, me not being a Black woman, for example, I will never know what it feels like, what my family, would have gone through, or what those struggles have been carried out through generations, if that makes sense. I don't even want to remotely put myself in that position where I have to explain myself or think that I'm comparing myself or my ancestry to somebody else. So that's why I struggle with this. And I would just rather say I'm Hispanic, or I consider myself a minority, or, and not just because I'm white. I'm literally white, like looking, white passing, but also because my ancestry is Middle Eastern, Arab, and European. So I legit am white. But as a Hispanic woman, I don't know. I just feel like this is very complicated.
So to kind of like, we've all established that it's complicated and it's dicey. So I want to go into like we had two definitions, but it's two spheres or two lenses to look at the terms. And I was briefly a linguistics minor for a little while before pivoting into history. So I actually found my NPR article because I was looking at the linguistic aspects of people of color. And then there's this one linguist, John McWhorter, who was quoted and interviewed on the Code Switch podcast. And he's a linguist from Colombia. So linguistics is like not exactly under the branch of sociology because it's very much based on language, but sociology obviously plays a role in how language develops. So I just want to preface that because his expertise is not sociology. However, linguistically, he describes people of color as simply like being white, or being white is the absence of color, like melanin, skin tone. That's what you're looking at. So anyone who has any type of color can be a person of color. Sociologically, people of color is kind of the term used for people who are subordinate to whites. That's kind of what you're inferring.
Mm-hmm.
So, formally, in terms of linguistics, somebody who is of color is in terms of melanin. And the idea is to have a term for people who are not white. Now, that's just simple, basic, foundational linguistics. But if you continuously look at linguistics in comparison to society, the human being walking around and who talks to others like can mean well, but if they look at someone else, it's because they don't see them, a white person sees them completely as their equal. Or there could be some sense of oppression in society that someone is looking at them slightly differently because something taught them to, because they don't look white. And when I think about it like that, I'm like, okay, maybe that's why my white friends don't look at me as white, because they know that I don't match up completely. And that's where I think, like, okay, that kind of makes things a little bit easier for me to understand the term, or like why it came about. It's still like not of the best. I agree with you all. But personally, McWhorter said like people should just be clear, especially in writing, like non-whites, not whites. Like, because that's what you're saying at the end of the day, and that's going to make it easier. And he says that he got some of his information from reading other books. For those, I'm not Asian, so I can't dive into it, but there is a book called Are Asian Americans White? It's more of a political discussion about why some Asian Americans may consider themselves white and why some don't, i.e., a lot of history, and they were racialized, so that's why
Right.
some consider themselves people of color. But it stayed with the trends because it's all about how this country in particular racializes someone. And again, these terms are very much in the United States. So I do want to dive into like, what does this mean for us Latinos?
I think as Latinos, we should steer clear of this word, honestly, because because of what we've been discussing all along. You know, you can be considered a person of color in one space when you're looking at other than white. All people coming from Latin America are other than white. That makes them people of color. But I feel like you can be in a space where other people may not have that definition and may only see that as being only black people or people of darker skin colors. Or you may be in a space where it's a more widely accepted term for any minority. So it kind of I honestly would not use it because it could offend someone, or you may be wrongly describing someone, or as even Danny said it, some people may find it offensive. So I think it's just a bad terminology overall. I think Hispanics and Latinos should just think too, hey, we're Hispanic, we're Latinos, we're minorities in the space. But I think people of colors just too much, and and maybe you get the wrong people using it too. So that's my qualm.
My take on this, I think, is for the most part, when somebody else labels you, like when it's society labeling you, there's a problem, because they're essentially making you feel smaller than, slash othering you, slash marginalizing you even more. And that's where it could be insulting. However, at the end of the day, it's such a personal thing. If you consider yourself a person of color, then that's up to you, the way you identify yourself, and for no one else to say anything else.
So even though Hispanics fall within the dicey definition because we're an ethnicity, not a race, how have we been racialized? Are we brown enough? All those questions that may loom. And to be honest, remember, y'all, this type of conversation, like a purely brown person, like someone who knows that they are brown, probably isn't debating whether or not they're a person of color the way we are right now. And that's why we brought this topic up, is that some people know full in their hearts if something applies to them and can be fully supportive of it. Others can claim that this is a term that needs to go in the garbage, which it seems to be a consensus among us. So
Just like labels in general.
it's just really tough out here. And we really wanted to address this topic because it's tough for our community. So whether you identify as a person of color or not, we do want to warn, please do not go around and asking people, are you a person of color? Please speak from the I and know your identification on your own. We just wanted to give you these tidbits to think about, talk about, and maybe lean on to this next person and say, Oye, let's talk. How do you identify so we can properly have the same middle ground?